Me and my parents were visiting my aunt, who was getting quite along at an age that I needed help deciding what was going to happen to her after she was gone. She didn't have any surviving family that would inherit her place, so, to keep all the others from squabbling it was decided that it would be a good idea for her and my dad, and perhaps even my mother, to sit down together and talk about a good procedure to follow when the house was no longer in her hands. I was only 16 at the time, but I wasn't necessarily invited to be part of the proceedings that would take place with the committee. So, I was encouraged to stay out of the way, preferably by playing outside. Well, I was 16, so I didn't have any plans to play outside. Maybe take a brooding teenage introspective walk. My aunt stopped me as I had my foot in the door. She told me that it would be smart if I watched myself carefully. The garden, she explained, wasn't off limits, but I didn't need to be careful. She wouldn't explain why. I would ask her, but she would just kind of shrug her shoulders. I wasn't sure what to make of it, so I more or less forgot about what she said as soon as I had stepped outside. It was a beautiful house and a nice property. The more I wandered around, the more I could see why she had spent so much time there by herself. It wasn't a mansion by far, but it was big enough that you could be satisfied to either roam around inside or outside. Both the garden and the general yard was very spacious. I came to the edge, where the plants were almost as ancient as the stones that dotted it. It was then that I remembered my aunts telling me to be careful in the garden. I looked for anything that seemed like it could have easily been broken or fragile, but I saw no such thing. Anything that wasn't a plant was made out of solid rock and was masterfully carved, if not somewhat dated. I looked for anything I could that I would hurt myself on, period. Nothing was pointy or sharp. I saw no such possibility, and so I was very puzzled over why my own aunt would tell me to be careful. I absently began strolling around the confines of the garden, more put at ease than off by it. It was laid out in a strange circular design. The central was beautiful, as it was carved, but slightly unusual. It was made in the form of a larger dog, but there was something wrong about the whole thing. Its entire body looked like porous volcanic rock, and the scale of this thing was immense. It was more the size of a black bear than a dog, and its face was a frozen, horrible expression of rage, and its back was even arched. The most puzzling detail about the sculpture was its eyes, or lack thereof. Maybe it had defined eyes at one point in time, but the decades of being weathered by the elements had clearly rubbed them away. Any detail of eyes were lost among the pocks and holes natural to the volcanic rock. While I was studying the bizarre dog statue, in that time that it took me to naturally blink and open my eyes, the head had gone from staring straight ahead to turning and looking at me. I jumped out of my skin, but somehow managed not to yelp. 2 points of light behind 2 pinhole-sized pockmarks in the dog's head lit up like cherries, giving the sculpture to glowing eyes for just a few seconds before burning out again. Before I could seriously think that I was going crazy, I could smell the stink of molten, burning rock. I promptly went inside and stayed there, but I stayed quiet so that I wouldn't be discovered right away. I made myself known when I could tell that the discussions about the fate of the property were over. Before leaving, my aunt told me to come to her side, as she had a question. She asked me if I would be interested in possessing the property if she passed on. I declined as politely as possible, and she gave me the strangest, perhaps the eeriest smile I had ever seen her make, and she told me that she understood. So how do I go around openly telling people what just happened to me? I can't. Nobody will believe me. In fact, I'm probably even sending this to you in vain. So, Here's to hopes you actually take me seriously. I have an extensive history of night terrors. They are frightening, and if you share them, then you know what I mean. You often feel like you're being brought within inches of your life when you go to sleep. Most of them, luckily, are confirmed to be hallucinations. Me, I'm not always so sure that what I experienced is all in my head. The short explanation is that you wake up in a state where your body is physiologically asleep, but your mind is mostly awake. The dream switch is still activated, so you are paralyzed and still being piped vivid imagery from your mind. But you're awake and aware, so that the real and the dream overlap, mostly in horrifying and awful ways. It's not unusual for people to report being weighed down by all kinds of entities, gray aliens, old hags, whatever nightmare creature described. They all perform the same function. A rational explanation for why your body can't move. So, that's why I'm inclined to think that some of what I experienced isn't just my nighttime functions proceeding as normal. The things that I've been seeing have started appearing a little bit before I'm even in bed. This began about a month ago, when I started having night terrors that would take the form of a large dog that felt like it weighed 2 tons. I expected to hear my ribs cracking whenever it jumped onto the bed. That horrible thing became a nightly visitor. Then, it took a step further and started appearing in my doorway as soon as I'd get into bed. Nobody could see it but me. It would disappear when I called for my parents. Then, it started sticking around and watching my parents enter and leave the room. Then, it would flash me a grin of teeth that looked like long white ice picks, and its eyes would always glow like 2 red laser pointers. Each time it jumped on the bed, it was worse. It was getting heavier. Then it would get hot. And at first, a terrible smell accompanied it, like death and rot. Things that you should not be able to smell while supposedly dreaming. But then it started smelling like the room was on fire. I'd be in a panic, thinking that the house was on fire when I'd smell this thing. It took this dimension of things even further and began giving off an awful stink of sulfur, like rotten eggs but more intense. Then, it began heating up the bed until I felt like I was being burned and crushed and suffocated simultaneously. I would tell my parents about it every single day, and they did get concerned for a bit, but then they just started getting annoyed. Telling them about it each day got more eye rolls than support. It wasn't like I had any way of proving the thing actually existed. The horrible dog's visits began to taper off the older I got, but they did not stop completely. That is, until I moved out of the house. Recently, my parents had begun to renovate the house to prepare it for the market, so they could downsize to something smaller and easier to manage. My father, against my mother's wishes, let me in on something that they found in the walls of what was my room. Tucked inside was a skull, possibly a monkey's, that was inscribed with all kinds of evil-looking symbols and markings. I'm no occultist, but I did see a demonic-looking rune on the brimstone underneath the left eye of the skull. My father gave me the most awkward apology possible. It was better than nothing. My mother didn't even want to admit that such awful things was inside their home, and that it had plagued me right under her nose for years, and she never took me seriously. Not once. So, do you feel like this occultic artifact could be the reasoning I've been having these demonic sightings over the years? I know nothing of the history of this house, or anyone who had owned it prior, or anything they did. It must have been old, since it was put behind old sheetrock that my dad had to tear out to redo that part of the wall. Anyway, that's my experience. I hope you enjoyed my story. I was walking along my favorite trail in the woods. It was a public reserve that got plenty of regular traffic, so it's not the sort of place you would visit and expect to see anything unusual. I knew the trails like the back of my own hand, having gone on them so much. So, it occurred to me to start looking for pathways off the trails that might not be so obvious. Perhaps I could discover some new dimensions to my more than familiar stomping grounds. So, I began heading off the trail at random points, with no real rhyme or reason, just looking to see if I could possibly end up someplace new and exciting. I discovered a worn path that was noticeable only because the thorns surrounding it were laying a bit lower than the others from traffic. This was certainly not a part of the reserve I had seen before, so my excitement grew instantly. The further down the path I went, the more my clothes got caught in the brambles and thorns, and I got this strange paranoid feeling that something didn't want me to continue down the trail. A most ridiculous notion, and very irrational. I just needed to lose weight, so that there was less of me for the plants to grab onto. The trail became more cramped and choked, and my calves were starting to look like raw hamburger, which served me right for heading off the trail in shorts, I guess. And just like that, the trail opened up into a clearing where the husk of some old shed stood. My heart threatened to stop in my chest when I saw what was inside. It looked to be like some sort of black fire churning and swirling, just like something out of a nightmarish storybook. And a set of red eyes looked at me, and then another set, and yet a third. The fire appeared to be divided into 3 separate masses, each with their own set of hellish red eyes. They began moving towards me, revealing what they had been sitting on. It was a body, badly bloated and purple. I don't know anything about autopsies, but I'm pretty sure I saw that her throat had been cut. Whether it was a knife or by some power of 3 phantoms that began moving towards me, I wasn't sure. The closer they got, the more I could see that they had the overall shape of dogs, though they were big enough to be bears. From their blackness glinted sharp teeth besides their eyes. Their bodies were appearing to be in black flames that also had these bizarre movements that nearly made them look like tentacle-like appendages. The stench of the body blended with the smells of the burning smoke. In complete and utter terror, I fled. I reported the body without a moment's hesitation, and I was questioned as a matter of course. And the questions kept coming back to me. And apparently, this was the doing of some cult in the area. Apparently, they'd been having issues for years, and nobody had bothered to report on them or make the public aware. When I was cleared of any involvement, a polite detective chatted me up a little and told me that this was by far the cult's most visible act yet. So much so that they wondered if it was a botched job by an initiate, which is why I was questioned. On top of all that, the girl found dead, while her name wasn't released to the public that I'm aware of, was actually found to be a member of that same cult. Interesting. I thought I would share this with you, because it's my only experience I've ever had in life that I actually dealt with demons and the supernatural in a physical manifestation. The beings that I saw that chased after me, I believe firmly, without a doubt, these were demons, hellhounds to be exact. Why they were attached to this dead body, I'm not sure. Maybe it was some sort of cult ritual. Maybe, just maybe. I work in a prison. I'd like to say that it's rewarding, that I get to see men change from animals to civilized human beings who realized what they've done and spend the rest of their lives making up for it. But this is Super Max, filled with the worst kind of humankind. And it pays well. Lots of bennies. That's the only reason I do this. Having been a CO for quite some time, you see a lot. We have a lot of death in here. As hard as we try, there are always times the cons manage to get each other, and there are a lot of gangbangers doing life. And although they are meant to be kept separate, for our safety as much as theirs, they got people doing their bidding all over. But this is all expected. Then, you add in all the usual illnesses that come from a weird lifestyle, and just the usual age stuff when you got crazy old lifers in here. And sometimes, I get the chance to foresee it. But not in a clairvoyant way, like I may have made it seem. I get a visitor. The first time that it happened, I won't lie, it was the single most terrifying thing that I have ever experienced. It topped being trapped in a room with a cannibal serial killer who had broken his restraints. I was outside doing a perimeter check, as it was early evening and close to lockdown. Back in the cage, buddy time. Very occasionally, one of the guests likes to try and spend a bit more time in the open air, so we always check. It was a pretty cool evening. I remember that I could see my breath. Then this awful smell hit me. It reminded me of science class back in high school, when one of the senior guards had been eating deviled eggs. I recognized the smell as sulfur, like I had somehow known. Still, obnoxious smells can't detract us from the job. Otherwise, none of us would work in Cell D after they've served chili in the canteen. So on I went, the smell growing stronger, and then I heard the growl. Some Super Maxes are smack bang in the middle of cities. Ours is pretty secluded. You don't have to drive too far to get back into civilization. It's around a 30-minute journey back to my place. But there isn't much actually around here, so it's not unusual for animals to come sniffing around. Therefore, a growl from the other side of the secure fencing was by no means anything for me to be concerned about. I could just about make out the form of a large dog, and it was large. That thing sure wasn't wild and feeding off what little scraps it could find. At the point, it had its back to me, so I could not see the face, just the huge hulking jet black body that looked more like a wolf than your regular dog. And then it turned and faced me. I'm no expert, but I sure as hell ain't no writer. When I looked into this being's eyes, I felt hell. Fire. Satan. Don't ask me how it's possible. This thing just oozed malevolence. A harbinger of death. It's like my inner spirit just knew that this was a hellhound. It appeared to be gazing into my soul, the fires of its eyes burning into me. I thought I was dead, that it would leap through the fence or leap through it and get me. It looked like it probably had some sort of superpower that could do that. But instead, it bared its teeth, heckles up, growling. Then it gave a horrendous growl and seemed to just kind of evaporate into air. It didn't turn and run, nor did it disappear. It simply kind of just vanished, much in the same way that vapor dissipates. It was terrifying, to say the least. I might have remained standing there like an idiot if my radio had not suddenly come to life, scaring me. Good job I got a strong heart. There was a panicked message coming through from one of the newer guys. He'd been doing his regular patrol when he slipped and fell. When he looked down to see what had caused his mishap, it was blood. And the blood he had fallen into had come from a now very much deceased body of a particularly child molester who had been shanked. Protocol and cleanup took precedent for a while then, and I almost forgot about old Red Eyes outside. I did some research on the internet as soon as I could, and thanks to some anonymous discussion via Reddit and other sources, I discovered the phenomena of the HELLHOUND. Since that day, I've seen this demonic entity 3 more times, always around certain areas where some of the most evil and sinister prisoners are. I have never mentioned it to anybody else, but one time, the sighting was in the perfect place to have been caught on camera. So after our visit, and the inevitable cleanup of a gang member who liked to torture the family members of his rivals, choked to death after being force-fed his own fingers. But of course there was nothing. Just me, stood staring at the fence. There's only so many people I can send this to, and not lose my career and be taken seriously. So, people like paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and people like you, who take time to read other people's stories and encounters. While I'm sure you get many counterfeit stories, I hope that mine, the genuinity in it, can stick out above the rest. And whoever hears this, if you decide to read it, can feel brave enough to come forth with theirs. No matter how fake it sounds, there is always somebody out there who will denounce your claims as fake. My brother is a scout leader, and every so often, he takes the kids camping out in the woods. He loves it. They love it. My nephews are a part of his troop, and even his wife goes along for the ride. In the 15 years or so they've been doing it, they've never had more than a nasty case of poison oak. The occasional puking after too many s'mores and a bedwetter once in a while. So, when he came straight to my house the evening after a camp, with huge bags under his eyes, and looking paler than I'd ever seen, I knew something was up. Since I teach at the school where a lot of the kids attend, my first thought was that something had happened to one of them, and I was already dreading the terrible news. Thankfully, everybody was fine. It was just my brother that had the scare, and he had carried on more than usual in the morning, merely stating that he must have had a bad sausage, as he had been awake all night, with terrible pains. They'd packed up and escorted all the kids home safely, ensuring they were none the wiser, just feeling bad for him, and equally for his wife, as they giggled the tent must have been full of gas. His wife was now busy with laundry and stowing the equipment, so he had to come to see me. Lucky me. Turns out, of course, there had been a dodgy sausage, and sometime in the early hours, he crept to a toilet. On his way back, feeling better, he had smelled something terrible. Something like sulfur. He couldn't work out where on earth such a powerful and obnoxious odor was coming from, and how it had just suddenly appeared. Still, he didn't want to hang around to find out, since it was of course in the middle of the night, and he was standing in his PJs. He was about to head back to the warmth of his bed, when he heard a low crunching sound, followed by a rumbling noise. As he was telling me this, although it hardly seemed possible given the state of him, he visibly paled even further. He explained to me it was a dog, a large black dog, that resembled more of a bear, being so big and powerful. He said it just stood there, head down and teeth bared, making this horrendous growling noise, and the smell of rotting eggs got even stronger. I could tell there was something more though, something he was holding back. A smelly wild dog would be scary, but he is used to animals. He would know how not to make eye contact, no sudden moves, etc. That couldn't be the extent of what had him looking like death. To my utmost surprise, neither of us have followed the faith we were brought up with much anymore. By now, I was beginning to wonder if he was experiencing some sort of breakdown. There's more, he told me. The dog had evil eyes, as if it had come straight from the pits of hell. These demonic entities are supposed to collect the souls of wrongdoers and drag them back down to hell with them. If you happen to encounter one, it's either going after you or somebody close by. There's no way my brother is headed anywhere but the pearly gates. so I guess this creature must have realized it had made a mistake. It took a long time for my brother to get over it, despite me trying to reassure him that the thing had come for the wrong person. It was a close call, but not something I think he will forget. I'm not really sure what to make of it all. It's bizarre, but I try not to believe in such fairy tales, although I can't refute what he said he saw, because it really affected him. And knowing my brother, he's not affected by things easily, nor is he the type to make kind of stories like this up. So, part of me believes him. I was camping at a favorite site in Tennessee. There was far more wilderness than there was campground, so you got a real sense of being close to the wild. It was the warm season, so it was expected that the nights would be unusually hot. But after a certain point, there is such a thing as too much heat that will make you suspicious, especially when it's accompanied by an orange glow. I woke up to all kinds of flickering light and heat pulsating through the thin walls of my tent. When I unzipped it, it looked as though I was in the middle of a blazing forest fire. The heat was suffocating, and I feared that I had woken up a few minutes too late to save myself. But I was still going to try. I couldn't think of anything more terrifying than being burned alive. The only thing that made sense in the moment was getting dressed to a point that I wouldn't be guilty of indecent exposure, and having feet that would be able to run across the rough terrain. No sooner had I stepped outside of my tent, ready to run, than I was confronted with the shapes of animals that began emerging from the walls of fire. At first, I thought they were unfortunate creatures that had been trapped in the blaze, but it became all too apparent that they were something else. They were moving comfortably in the fire, and they were beginning to surround me. The closest thing I could compare them to were large wild dogs. Only dogs that had dark skin, stretched across rotting, throbbing muscles, and fire. Their tongues dangling all the way to the ground, and their eyes hollow and empty black holes, with this ember glow coming from within. For a few long moments, these demons or hellhounds, whatever the hell you want to call them, were far more terrifying than the fire I felt, or the woes of experiencing pain and torment on a level that far transcend flesh. With that awareness, I dove back into my tent for something. My grandmother's Bible. Something she had made me promise I would carry around at all times. As I dove back into my tent, I immediately jolted up outside of my body, waking up in my tent. Everything was fine, clutching that Bible close to me. I was covered in sweat and grime, as if I had just been in an actual situation I perceived moments ago. In fact, my skin was even still warm, as if I had been very close to a fire. It was terrifying. I believe I had some sort of supernatural out-of-body experience, but I don't know what else you'd call it. The forest around me, that was once on fire just moments ago, was fine. Everything was dark, quiet, and serene, whereas just moments ago, everything was a blazing inferno. It was not a dream, because how do you explain the grime, the heat? I was literally clutching this Bible that was in my backpack beforehand, which means that in this vision, or whatever I had, as soon as I pulled the Bible out of my backpack, this happened. I have no idea how to explain this. Even though this was many, many years ago, it still is hands down one of the creepiest hallucinations or experiences or visions I could possibly happen to me. My mother had brought home an unusual stone statue of a dog. She was an ancient Egyptian enthusiast and jumped at the chance to own anything authentic and connected to any pyramids. Like the arrowheads you can buy for just a few bucks, from time to time, There are Egyptian relics that evidently weren't going to sell for millions. So, they end up being marketed to people like my mom. This statue looked like it was trying to be this dog-headed Anubis, but with more infernal detail than I have ever seen in any history book or National Geographic. The teeth were showing, the forehead wrenched into expression. The skin was torn and painful. It was full of holes, and I wondered if it was the work of some ancient demented art student. My mother thought it would be great to place it in the living room, as long as it did not go in my room. I would be fine with whatever she decided with, or so at the time I had thought. Very suddenly, that night, I became a restless sleeper. I would awake with a start, and not know why. I didn't recall having any bad dreams, and I hadn't heard anything. At least not at first. As those annoying nights became a pattern, I eventually began hearing something just at the edges of my awareness. Something like speech, but garbled and layered, as if several whispers were bound and gagged, and trying to have an argument with each other. I was, and still am, a master of denial. At the time, I tried to talk it up to tinnitus, but my sleep got worse, and I started waking up, seeing shadows moving in my room that had no apparent source. I drew the line when the shadows began taking a definitive shape, the form of a dog, having horns and a ghoulish face and expression, sitting in the doorway to my bedroom, waiting for me to see it before it would slowly saunter its way downstairs. I'll never forget its eyes, or a lack thereof. Just large empty black sockets where nothing was there. It's kind of like a shark's eyes. Black, lifeless, haunting. I told my mother about the visitations and how I thought it was connected to her dog relic. She wasn't repulsed, just fascinated, and that was just another reason why she and I had a hard time getting along. I couldn't talk her into fully getting rid of the thing. She settled for setting it outside. My sleep did improve, but not entirely. The shadows would tap at my window incessantly until I woke up and looked at them. They would then congeal into the shape of a dog with even longer horns than before, sometimes reminding me of a sheep's. Needless to say, I took the first chance I got to move away, out of home. Eventually, I found out that my mom eventually got rid of the statue. What she did with it, I'm not sure. I had always wanted a dog, so when my parents finally gave in and got one years ago, I was ecstatic. They told me all about having responsibility, and I did. I loved that dog with all my heart. My mom used to laugh that I had two moms now, her and Millie. Millie would growl at anybody who came up to us, putting her body between them and me in a way to protect me, which was adorable because she was so small, but it was obvious she'd do anything to look after me. She would whine if I was unhappy, bark and wag if I was excited. She was incredible, but that's not why I write to you. One day, I decided to take her on a walk down by the river. There were lots of trees to sniff on and pee, which is why we take a ball, which she'd dutifully bring me over and over again. While having so much fun, I hadn't even realized that the time was ticking, and it was beginning to get dark. Millie didn't appear to be tiring either. We could have stayed there all evening. I thought that I would give her a couple of really good throws. So I hurled the ball, and it landed just behind the tree line at the start of the wooded area next to the river. Usually, she loves heading in there to retrieve the ball, but this time, she got to the start of the trees and stopped. She went straight into defense mode, ears back, growling. I've never seen her act like that. Maybe a couple of other times, but not like this. She was clearly warning me of a danger. Something was in the woods. I'm not sure what. Whatever was in there now was getting the full-on don't mess with Millie treatment. Of course, I thought it was cute at first, because I was under the initial impression it was a squirrel, and was in no way concerned. I mean, what could possibly be in those woods that would be a threat? We don't exactly have bears or cougars around here, at least to my knowledge. So, I stepped closer, and she did something I have never seen her do. She bares her teeth at me, and made to nip me, as if to say, back off. Now, that had me slightly worried, I must admit, as she had never ever shown any animosity towards me ever. I could have wrangled a bone from her mouth, and she would let me. She had never as much even growled at me, let alone this, so I knew something was up. However, it did not deter me, and I still approached her, carefully. She barked again, and for some reason, I got the feeling from her that she wasn't angry. She was protecting. As if in answer, I saw a sudden movement in the trees, near to where I had aimed the ball. It was beginning to get dark, and obviously, it was even darker already under the canopy of leaves, and it was hard to make out exactly what was freaking out my dog. I could just about make out the form of what I suppose was an animal, although the mass appeared so large, I couldn't possibly think what it could be. I was enlightened somewhat once I heard growling, and then I saw exactly why she was so hellbent on protecting me. Its eyes appeared to be glowing, unnaturally. You might be thinking it wasn't a full moon or anything like that, and no, it did not stand up and start howling. It stood its ground, glowing skin, dark fur, a strange demonic-looking face. This creature, this dog, whatever it was hideous. This thing slowly kept creeping its way towards both of us, keeping its awful demeanor, as if it wanted to kill us both. That's when my dog completely bolted in the opposite direction, running like I had never seen her run. I took off after her. Eventually, I found her cowering in a different section of woods. Whatever that thing was, I don't know what the hell it was. It didn't follow us, but we have never gone back to that section of trail that I used to walk her at, ever. All I can say is that it scared us both very badly. Something happened to me a few years ago while I was driving home, and it's made me question the existence of all things, even hell. I was coming home after having spent a few horrendous hours in the hospital, consoling my mother, as her brother had been taken ill, and suddenly would likely remain there for several days until he recovered. I was there specifically for her. I couldn't stand my uncle. He was an a-hole, to put it simply. Cared about nobody but himself. I'm surprised my mom still had a relationship with him. I had stopped really any form of communication with him years ago. He'd been dead to me for a long time. But, although I wished him a drawn-out and painful death all alone, my mother meant the world to me, as if she was worried for her brother, even though to me he was one of the nastiest humans alive. I had to swallow my hatred to be there. I felt dirty as I drove home, unable to feel an ounce of sorrow for the man. It was whilst I was imagining a long hot shower in which I would scrub this nastiness off me, when I saw something out of the corner of my window. It was a dog, standing by the side of the road. God only knows what kind of dog it was, because it was so enormous. Its head looked like the size of a regular dog, but the body was jet black, and appeared to have fire coming from it. As it reared its head, it looked more rotted and skeletal, like some sort of cadaver. It was horrendous. This creature was terrifying. That's when it quickly turned its head to look over in my direction, where I ducked down, hoping it did not see me. I carried on, still wondering what the hell that thing was. And you know what? Turns out that I guess I saw a hellhound. What's even creepier is hellhounds, I found out, are omens, because shortly after seeing that thing, my uncle had died, not even 15 minutes later. My mother had been trying to call me apparently and let me know, but I didn't have reception at the time. So I'm writing this to you because I believe now I have some sort of gift of clairvoyance where I can see these things that let me know if somebody's going to die. I'm not really sure what to think, and I would love some answers from you. Thank you. I was taking a breather from my usual rounds of the park. My day was predictable enough. I rolled around the paved roads in the park, looking for anything suspicious or illegal. Ended up just waving to everybody and stopping for a dozen coffee breaks like this one. I poured me a cup right up to the brim, and it was still very hot, piping billows of steam to the cold air. Well, that coffee ended up in my lap. It wasn't just a little jolt. It was the entire cup, to the point that I thought I had been sterilized. If you've ever spilt hot coffee on your lap or your groin, you'll probably know and feel what I'm talking about. Somebody had ran past my cruiser window and yelled as loud as possible, scaring me half to death, causing the scalding spill. I didn't get a good look at who did it, but, judging by the fits of giggling, it had to have been a small child. They ran into some tall grass, and all I saw was the grass folding in behind them. I appreciate kids, and I try not to leave them with the impression that the man is going to come and get them at the moment they step out of line. But that coffee, it hurt me pretty bad, and I was just mad enough to go looking to deliver a little 5-minute lecture. So, I took to chasing the kid, and it wasn't hard to do. As much giggling as they were seized with. Too funny for their own good, apparently. Despite how easy it was to stay on their trail, the kid managed to stay ahead of me by several paces. Quite an impressive feat, since I considered myself very much so in shape, and I figured I was hard to outrun. I was trying to gauge the age on this one. The grass came up to my waist, and I couldn't see any physical details of my assailant, just the movement that they made in the grass. My commands to freeze and to stop in the name of the law were soon washed away in that insane giggling. A kid that short couldn't have been older than 6 years old. But he or she was doing such a good job of staying ahead. It was embarrassing, and it didn't help my level of outrage. Now, here's where I can only report what I saw and what I think happened. I can't explain it through any rational means, and I barely believe my own words as it is, so bear with me. This kid rocketed into a thick bunch of orange trees. Those messy things that drop those softball-sized green fruits. I knew right away that they were taking me onto a trail where it would be much easier to see them and catch them. The trail only ran in 2 directions, north and south, and it was mowed very regularly, so I could tell this wasn't just some random trail in the middle of the forest. 2 strange things happened though when I passed by that boundary of orange trees. First, I didn't see the kid, but the giggling was still there, and it seemed to be all around me. Second, the trail seemed to extend into the infinite. It was like that trick where you hold a mirror up to another mirror, and you've got a hallway into forever. Yeah, it was like that. And I've patrolled that trail on foot many times, and it was never that long. I felt my forehead for any sign of a fever, and the only thing I was sweating from was running. And just like that, the giggling was coming from a clear direction again, north. I chased after it, expecting to see either the kid making it or the end of the trail. But I saw neither. I stood and looked around, wondering if I wasn't just starting to totally lose my mind. It was when I slowly turned to the opposite direction that I saw something on the ground. Spattered and pretty broken up, but there was a trail of something dark on the grass and the fallen leaves. It looked like oil, but some of it had a red cast to it where the sunlight fell on it through the canopy. My heart had begun to sink, and I asked myself, now could this be blood? I jumped pretty hard at another burst of giggles coming from the thicket where the trail of stuff led off to. There I found, underneath the broad skirt of blue spruce, a patch of earth that had just been very recently disturbed. There, I found the body of a small boy that was just barely identifiable by looks alone. The real detectives found out that he had an Amber Alert out on him for well over a week, 2 towns away, which, for those that don't know, is probably at least 40 miles. My brain started filling in the blanks in my experience chasing that giggling, and my rational side didn't want to hear it. At all, as a matter of fact. Something changed inside of me that day, and not really for the better. I can't look at those trees very long anymore. In fact, I can barely get myself to ever walk that trail. Just in case I end up hearing that giggling again, I'll have a shootout with some scum on the run in a dark alley, but I don't ever want to hear that giggling again. Look, being on this job, it's not rare that you run into all sorts of weird stuff. In fact, many of the things you encounter, some civilians would determine as paranormal or even unexplained. But I guess on this job, you just learn to get used to it and brush it off your shoulders. But then you have experiences like this, where an episode that I can't really write off as anything logical. It really creeps me out and sends a chill down my spine. There's no explaining what I saw nor what I heard. If it really was his ghost, well, there's a reason that it led me to his body. Maybe his spirit wanted me to find his body. I don't know. Was he murdered? I don't know. Was he potentially kidnapped and taken here? I was never told. But again, it's just a part of the job that you have to get used to. And even now, I still don't feel like I get fully used to these things. This story of mine is why I had decided to become a park ranger. I had taken a dare to do exactly what we had been told not to do. Go deeper into the swamp after dark. We were one of the 3 families that went camping in southern Illinois, where there's less cornfields and more woodland and marshes and campgrounds. It's a pretty wonderful area, if that's your climate. And besides, not necessarily in the swamp, but there's nothing like an Illinois thunderstorm. And Indiana as well, since we do share neighboring states. The summers can get pretty brutal out here. Very hot and muggy, and if you're anywhere from the Midwest, you've probably visited these states, and you probably just know how it has its own culture. Anyway, back to my story. There were probably 6 or 7 of us kids altogether. Just enough of us to decide that we were going to get into trouble as soon as we were left unchecked. My favorite. I didn't have the greatest appetite for trouble, but I also didn't want to be stuck with the dirty looks from my friends that I'd surely get if I did not go along with them. I mean, as a kid, peer pressure is everything, and if you don't follow along, you don't want to be the sore sucker out, which is part of the reason why I made the decision to go along with. It was one of those wetlands where the trees were almost standing up on their roots, and said trees were huge and almost ancient. I bet they had been there for so long, hundreds, if not thousands of years, however old swamps are. There always seemed to be a mist that hovered wherever the water was. It would thin out at times, but never fully disappear. If you think in your head of a traditional swamp, well, you're probably not deviating too far We were several nights into our camping trip, and the dark wetlands were alive with the voices of all kinds of unseen and terrifying things. What better way to keep things interesting than to dare everybody to go out and join everything living in the dark swamp at night? Something we were specifically told not to do. Our opportunity came soon enough. The adults thought we would listen to them when out of sight. And it was an era where it wasn't ridiculous to leave your children unsupervised at your campsite. The adults went to knock back a few drinks at the fire pit, just a few paces away where they could be less parents and more themselves. If you have kids, you'll know exactly what that's like. We got out our lanterns and plunged into the dark world that was roaring with night sounds, none of them necessarily pleasant. There wasn't any plan or purpose in motion once we acted on the dare. If there was, I had missed it long ago. I began to feel turned around, and I tried to spot my friends. Shouting would draw the attention of all of our parents. I couldn't hear anybody, and I lost sight of everything familiar. This is when I started to get scared. Being in an unfamiliar environment, with no sign of hope. If the din of the wetlands hadn't been so loud, I would have been able to hear my heart slamming against my ribcage as the darkness and the things filling it with noise felt like they were closing in on me, teasing at my clothes and threatening to invade them and share them with me. I can't tell you the joy that I felt when I was certain that I had spied the wavering light of a lantern, surely carried by one of my friends. I called out as quietly as I could, without possibly alerting any lumbering adult. The light began to draw near to me. I felt so much better. I had found somebody. I beckoned to whoever it was to keep coming. But then they stopped. They wouldn't speak or otherwise answer me. I began taking unsure steps towards them, and the light retreated with each step of mine, and I felt panic working its way back up into my chest. I begged them not to leave me behind, but they wouldn't listen. The faster I dared to come toward the light, the faster it backed away. Something, I don't know what, grabbed my wrist, and I was sure that I had been assaulted by a bear, and I felt free to shriek. A human hand covered my mouth, and I was looking into the face of one of my friends. She asked me what my problem was, and if I was blind, stupid, or both. I had no idea what she meant. Was she crazy? Had the swamp driven her to such acts of madness? She lifted her lantern ahead of the path that I had chosen, and the feeble rays exposed the ground as bristling with thorny vines and shrubs, the spines like daggers. I couldn't think of who would lead me into that sort of trouble. The dare itself was bad enough, but to lead me into running into my own death? My friend's lantern was just bright enough to light up the ground near where the deceiving light hovered. It was just a split second of visibility. It revealed that the light was not in a lantern, and there was nobody to do any holding. The light was simply by itself. Then it was gone. I dread to think of what would have happened if my friend hadn't seen me running headlong into peril. Was that light somebody else that didn't make it out of the swamp? Were they also deceived by some guiding light? I don't know. And to this day it still haunts me thinking about. Like maybe there's some sort of alien energy leading people astray purposefully in the swamp, to be lost and engulfed by Mother Nature forever, for their bodies and their spirits to become a part of the earth. That's my biggest fear. I had gone back to my tent, and I made every excuse I could to stay in it. To this day, I get heart palpitations at the sight of most nighttime illumination. Fireflies especially. Guess where I'm at? So, fast forward in time, and guess where I, a park ranger, is at? Yep, those campgrounds. The only thing more terrifying than what happened to me is the thought that it could happen to somebody else if I'm not around. I haven't seen the light or anything like it since, but I'll always be looking for it, and the kids that might see it. I don't want that ever happening to anybody else. As I've gotten older, I've heard more and more stories dealing with aliens and UFOs. I don't know how much about aliens and UFOs I actually believe in, but I can't refute the continuous stories that I hear from people and campers alike. Things about strange lights and sounds in the forest and the swamps, and even seeing figures walking around, glowing, apparently. Very weird stuff. Things that you would expect to see on the episodes of X-Files, or even Mysteries of America. Stuff like that. Have I seen or heard any of that stuff myself? Not since what I did when I was a kid. And even then, as much as it scared me, I consider it fairly minimal because I didn't see any glowing figures or any light moving, per se, or any large banging sounds happening deep in the swamp. It's always a creepy place if you think about it. I had one gentleman, about a year or so back, explain to me that he had this tall, white, nearly translucent humanoid figure chase him out of the swamp while he was exploring. He seemed pretty scared by it, and didn't come off as a druggie tripping out in the middle of the swamps. So, I'm not exactly sure. Although I had to take his story with a grain of salt, because anybody can make up anything. But, pairing that with all the other weird stories that happens around these swamps, it's weird. I'm not saying there's monsters out there, but I am saying there's things we can't explain. Lights, sounds, illusions even. And, as a ranger, I have to keep aware of those things and ensure everybody's safety, which means I have to be extra cautious being in these environments. So, partially, I'm here to tell you my story and experiences, but mostly, I wish you would wish me luck. After I retired, I took a job as a park ranger. At my age, that meant sitting in the lookout part of the lodge and drinking coffee while wearing a uniform and keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. You know, scary ghosts coming up on camera, a huge fire, maybe occultism, you know. Nothing ever really happened, which was fine by me. It made my job a lot easier. I mean, who doesn't want anything to happen on their job? But there was one day where my nerves shot from 0 to 100 pretty quickly. I can remember that it was cloudy weather, so I suppose there's some room to say that my eyes might have played some tricks on me. My post sits on the second floor of a lodge that is normally open to the public. People can come and go as they please within certain hours of the day, pick up brochures, look at certain animal bones kept behind glass. You know, one of those places you take your kids when there's absolutely nothing else left for them to do. Sure, it's a great place to have small talk with strangers, but it's also a place where I have to do my work. From my vantage point, up there in the Great Bay window, I can see trouble coming from a mile away. I looked down one day when the storm clouds were gathering thick, and poking above one of the bushes was the face of a woman. A beautiful one, to be exact. She was blonde and smiling a toothy grin. And, well, she seemed to be looking straight at me. But not just at me, into me. Like she was intimately looking into my soul. It was very charming to say the least for the first few seconds, I guess. But she didn't stop staring. She turned her head this way and that, and then looked back up at me, and kept the glare and the grin. I looked around to see if maybe I just thought I was in her line of sight. There wasn't anybody else on the ground. It was just me, and just her outside. So, not knowing what else to do, I just sipped on my coffee, very nervously. I heard of strange people roaming the woods, but I didn't think any of them would be cute young blondes. I pretended to not notice her, but she wasn't hardly fazed. She'd look one way, and then another. Once in a while, she might even completely turn around, but she always ended up facing me again, and her expression wouldn't change for anything. Against my better judgment, I went down to see if I can help her. Coming around behind the bush revealed that from her neck down, there was nothing. She was hanging from an eye hook that had been bored into her head, and she was strung up by some upholstery thread tied to one of the tree branches above her. Her lips had been stapled into a grin, and her eyelids had been stapled high so that she stared wide open. I know, it's one of the most disturbing cases I've ever dealt with. I reported everything, and she's still an unsolved case to this day. I didn't feel comfortable keeping with that job, and even writing this to you feels very uncomfortable to write about. I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of David Paulides' work, but his entire book series on Missing 411 details many accounts, just like mine, or similar to mine, of finding missing persons or even dead bodies among the forest and parks, all sorts of places. This is just one of my many disturbing accounts that I've had while working at that job. And if you do intensive search and rescue, sheesh, you will find a lot worse. And I don't even want to hear half of their stories, because they're just far too depressing and gruesome. I have seen more than my fair share of oddities during my time as a ranger, and always have plenty of stories to share, in exchange for a pint down at the local pub. Of course, the tales that get the biggest round of applause are always the times that I've spotted, or sometimes a party, or sometimes a couple. Let's just say it's generally people having a good time. It takes all sorts, and I've seen it all. Trust me. And being a ranger, you see your fair share of nonsense and debauchery. However, that's all just a bit of the harmless fun. And you don't want to hear about the steamy car windows. So, I'm writing to you because I want to tell you that this has nothing to do with any of that stuff. Those are stories that you share with your mates. This one, however, won't make you laugh or shout, "Nice one." This is probably the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed, and you are the first person I have ever told it to. So, it happened one night, a couple of years ago. Now, despite my stories of finding couples in cars and doing other things out of the woods, I don't actually do a lot of shifts in the dark. Vandalism is minimal, and it is usually too damn cold to find illegal campers. But, every so often, something happens, and the bosses think it is a good idea for one of us rangers to perform a quick patrol in the van once the sun finally goes down. It just so happened that there had been a couple of nasty and unprovoked attacks a couple of towns over, and although police had no evidence of the Moors were linked in any way, the boss thought it would be good for the community, just to see some sort of authoritative presence. So, off I go, in the van to drive around, and report back if I see anything suspicious. Apparently, his latest victim had managed to protect herself, and had smacked him around the head before legging it. Good on her. Now, unless I happen to see a man waving a flag stating I am a rapist, I wasn't entirely sure what I was meant to be looking for. Driving around the moors at nighttime is quite enjoyable, as well as the various pint-worthy stories. You get to see your fair share of British wildlife. Creatures your average Joe would never be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of. I'm speaking of things like badgers, foxes, deer, hares, all manner of birds. And once, a long time ago, mind a border collie that had escaped its owner and had been wandering around for days trying to find its way home. So at first, when I saw what I supposed was a dog, I wasn't actually scared. This creature was huge, and if I hadn't had the headlights on full beam, I wouldn't have seen it, since it was black as the night. It was facing away from me, even though it appeared to be the size of a small horse. I wasn't afraid, yet. Opening my car door carefully with the engine idling, I made a step out of the van to try and get it to come over. If it was a lost pet, it was likely hungry and would come to me if it thought food might be an offer. I whistled to it, calling it over, patting my leg. Then, my poor vision of this thing became very clear. It turned to me. Now, as I said, up until now, I wasn't frightened, but then, it looked right at me. I'm not really a big fan of horror movies in really any way. They're just not my cup of tea. But when I looked into that, this dog's bright red glowing eyes, I knew it was something sent straight from hell. I'm not a religious man at all. Until that moment, I didn't even know I believed in such thing as hell. But that thing in front of me could have been right out of the pages of a Stephen King book. I stood there for a moment or two. To be honest with you, I was frozen with fear. The pure malevolence exuding from this beast was like nothing I'd ever felt before. Yet somehow, I seemed to sense that whatever reason it was there, it wasn't for me. Regaining some of my faculties, I get back into the van, never taking my eyes off of it, and then sped out of there like there was no tomorrow. I didn't even sign off a report back to base. I drove home, crawled into bed with a bottle of Bell's, and down almost half the bottle before I finally passed out, trying to let my brain process with heavy inebriation and time. Next morning, I woke up with a banging headache and the answer phone flashing like it was Blackpool illuminations. Once I managed to prise my eyes open, I listened to my messages. Police were all over the moor. They'd found the supposed rapist, and he was dead. Although, it was presumed he died from exposure due to the freezing overnight temperatures. Alongside the untreated head wound, one of the officers claimed the guy looked as if he died of fright. A look of abject horror frozen over on his face forever. I knew right then and there exactly when they'd found him, and exactly what he'd seen. My only conclusion to this story is this man and I had both seen what they call a hellhound, come to Earth to claim the soul of a monster. These things are real, and there's no doubt that what I saw came from the very pits itself. Whether it was for me or somebody else, I'm not sure. But I don't think it was an accident that I happened to run into this creature, as bizarre as it was. So, if you yourself happen to run into anything strange or out of the ordinary, don't expect it to be a mistake. There's a reason for these things happening. And maybe it was putting a mark on me for a future reference. I guess I'll know soon enough. I've been a park ranger up here in Maine for a very long time. I'm sure many others who do the same job as me will give you the go-around, but I'm not going to be shy about it. I've seen all sorts of weird and wonderful things, but nothing that I would ever classify as scary or unexplained. That is, until now. Growing up, listening to Art Bell on Coast to Coast, and watching The Night Stalker, I had heard my share of alien encounters and things that go bump in the night. Whilst I love all that stuff, I didn't believe a word of it. Until now. You see, I was making a routine patrol one evening in a particularly dense wooded area up near the very top of Maine. There'd been a couple of reports filed by hikers about mutilated moose being found on the trail. It's not the most unusual thing that can happen. You wouldn't believe what some predators do to their prey. But this, well, it was kind of unusual by the animal kingdom's standards. You see, these moose had been drained of their blood If this was an episode of CSI or some cop drama and we were talking about humans, they'd very likely presume that this was just a dump site and the victim had been killed elsewhere. But this was a moose. Ain't no animal predator I know of that is clever enough to pull a Dexter. In fact, there's only so many animals that even go after and target moose, which again, makes it very limited. So, patrols were up to try and see exactly what type of creature was attacking our wildlife. I'd been driving around for hours when I saw it. Now, I have to tell you, despite being an avid fan of those cryptozoology shows and the like, as I said, I didn't believe in any of it. I just simply enjoyed it for entertainment purposes and thought it was nothing but a bunch of fan fiction. So, when I saw this thing over the ground, next to a fallen moose, let's just say I thought it must have been a coyote or something. Maybe some sort of deformed, mutated animal. I thought maybe a large, mangy coyote with grayish, scaly skin. Oh, and spikes going down his back. Definitely a coyote. Because, I'm telling the God's honest truth here, that was exactly what it looked like. Some sort of messed up mix between a dog and a reptile, with scaly, nasty looking skin, and real sharp lizard spines running down its back. Oh, and it had its head buried into the moose, as if it were sucking out the blood. I'm not ashamed to say that I did not get out of my truck. I just sat there, staring at this thing in front of me, trying like hell to somehow rationalize what I was seeing. Was I processing this correctly? Was I seeing some sort of illusion? Then, as I'm deep in thought, trying to process the horror before me, it turned and looked right at me. There was no way at this point now that I could pretend like it was some type of normal animal with some kind of weird mangy disease or mutation. No, sir. The head that looked at me was that of some type of reptile. It had huge bulging black eyes, razor-sharp teeth, which at the moment seemed to be dripping with blood. It didn't try to come near me, but quickly hissed at me and then shot off into the woods, like just my utter presence alone had disturbed it. I don't know how long I sat there in the truck, too damn scared to get out and look at the poor creature on the floor. I knew for sure without needing to check that it was indeed dead. Eventually, I willed myself out, one hand on my hip, just in case. I headed over to the moose, and just as I suspected, it was dead. I ain't no veterinarian, but I was willing to bet $1,000 that I knew why. 3 small holes appeared near its head, where whatever thing I looked at had seemed to drain every last bit of blood from it, and I caught it mid-heist. I dragged that poor damn beast onto the back of the truck and took her back. The so-called experts were baffled. Of course, I didn't dare tell them what I had seen, because as I said, I've watched enough of these shows over my lifetime that I don't need them to tell me. Although we never had any more unexplained moose deaths, but I swear to you right now, that reptilian-like dog creature I saw, I'm pretty convinced it was a chupacabra. And before you go off calling me fake for pulling a moose onto the back of my truck, it was still a very small adolescent moose. Not that big. I don't know exactly how the biology works with moose, if at any point they separate from their moms or how that works. But perhaps this one was pulled away from its mother, and, well, this creature had its way with it. Anyway, I'm fairly certain that I saw my first ever cryptid, and that, my friend, is a chupacabra. I know they're real, and while it seems odd to me that I've seen one of these creatures up in Maine, from everything I've heard, I would expect to see them down in like New Mexico or Arizona. So this was news to me. But I guess they're everywhere. And it just goes to show you that nowhere is truly safe. No matter if you're in the woods or even in your backyard, there's always something watching you. I have no doubt that you will have heard of the Grand Canyon. I mean, hell, you might have even visited at least once or twice. Maybe on a day trip, whilst escaping the depravity of the Strip for a while. Or maybe you just enjoy the nature of things and the scenery. For me, it was a bit of both. See, I grew up in Las Vegas, and as a lot of folk do, first couple of jobs I had were in those casinos. I seen enough in my time there to fuel a lifetime of nightmares. Drunken debauchery, people screaming, all sorts of crazy stuff. I needed out, for the sake of both my physical and mental health. A complete and utter change of career, and you couldn't get much more polar opposite than the casino host to a park ranger, could you? And let me tell you, I loved the drastic change. Of course, there were stories that some of the old hands liked to try and scare us new guys with. Tales of ghosts, the disembodied thudding sounds of something in the dark, sounding like a body landing on the ground, but when nobody else was around. There'd been a few accidental deaths there over the years, same as any place with a high number of visitors. People die at Disneyland each year, so of course things are going to happen here. But see, I believe in monsters. I'd seen my fair share of them back in those hotel rooms, and they're always human, real as you or I. No matter what the others said, I knew they were just trying to spook us, throwing silly ghost stories at us, trying to get under our skin, make us uncomfortable. I wasn't the spooking kind. That's why I'm pretty sure that what I heard that night, well, it must have been one of them pranking me. It didn't matter that I was meant to be the only one on that particular rotation. One of them could have snuck in. It's really the only way I can explain it. You see, I didn't mind volunteering for the third shift, and unlike most of them, I lived alone. I ain't got a wife or kids to worry about, and I'm perfectly at ease in the dark, with only myself for company. Even patrolling in a spot where, allegedly, a father and son fell to their death nearly 100 years ago. I didn't feel any cold spots, didn't see any orbs floating about, none of that crazy stuff. Like I said, I hardly believed in any of that BS anyway, because as I've told you, my experience with monsters was dealt in the casinos and the hotels. That is, until it all changed with this god-awful scream. It was an awful wailing scream that I had never heard before. In fact, it sounded like some lady was being murdered. I rose the alarm on my radio and grabbed my gun quickly. It sent shivers down my spine, and I felt an unknown terror like I'd never felt before. It was my instincts kicking in full. I called out, asking where she was, telling her I could help her. But I was only met with the silence of the night and more darkness. Nothing. I searched and searched, and by the time my backup arrived, I began to think I'd imagined the entire thing. What luck, right? Way to feel like a fool. Until my boss appeared. He had a very solemn look upon his face. Taking me into the office after dismissing the others, he proceeded to tell me the full story. You see, around 100 years ago, this man and his son did accidentally fall to their death. But, even more tragically, the wife and mother happened to see it. A few weeks later, unable to cope with her grief, she had returned and flung herself to her death, intending to join her husband and son, screaming all the way down until she hit the hard bottom. And, of course, the anniversary of her suicide. Well, lucky me, It was exactly 100 years ago to that same day. I'm not trying to sit here and convince you that I encountered the cry of the motherly ghost, but what I am trying to convince you that I heard something that I can't exactly explain, and although I want to chalk it up to my colleagues, I can't be exactly certain how they managed to do it, how they managed to match the timbre and the pitch and the volume of the scream, even imitating the fall all the way down the canyon. It was terrifying to say the least, and even though I don't consider myself a believer in ghosts per se, it's made me reevaluate what I truly believe and what I feel is actually out there, waiting to be discovered.